So let's go right into it. So again here, I did say before how we see SBTs as this overarching framework. And one key aspect of science-based targets is that we ask companies to take into consideration not only scope 1 and 2, but also scope 3 emissions. And let's say for most companies that we work with, both purchased goods and services and the upstream part of the scope 3, as well as the use of sold products, are the key areas. And I think we already heard pretty nicely from Novo Nordisk now what can be done as well to work towards this upstream portion to reduce emissions. And we're within CDP really trying as well to work with companies along that journey, supporting, setting standards, and just generally help, as this is very challenging for many still. So this is just still the... at the same time, as I said before, like raising the bar slowly from 1 year to the next. So I already said that in that science-based target setting process, it is obligatory to do a scope 3 screening. And that scope 3 screening can be done quite high level, but it has to be done. And if it shows that that scope 3 portion is more than 40% of the overall emissions, a scope 3 target needs to be set. And then the first very important part where we offer more flexibility for scope 3 targets compared to scope 1 and 2 targets is the boundary of the target. So scope 3 targets need to only cover 2/3 of your scope 3 portions. And this is really just to account for the fact that most companies, even companies that have started that journey a decade ago, had challenges to zoom in on all areas of that value chain, and for instance say, okay, it's quite normal, for instance, to start with the supply chain, right? And first focus on that. And we really want to see that companies start their journey, understand their value chain, and identify hotspots. And then in terms of methods, there is, let's say, 2 categories of targets. One option is to set your own target, and I'm going to go into the 3 different options of developing your own target in a minute. And the other option is to not set your own target, but ask your suppliers to set science-based targets themselves. That only makes sense if this portion of emissions that you have in the purchased goods and services categories, or from the products that you buy from your suppliers, is very high. For instance, perfect examples are retailers. So these are the 3 options that companies have to set their own targets. And I said earlier that what's important is that it's not obligatory to have science-based scope 3 targets or to use science-based methods to set scope 3 targets. We ask for these targets to be ambitious, measurable, and aligned with best practice. And we kind of define what that looks like. And the first option is very straightforward. It's to use the absolute contraction method that I presented earlier. And I said that with this new set of criteria, we're asking for this new level of ambition as a minimum of well below 2 degrees for scope 1 and 2. This does not apply for scope 3. So our scope 3 criteria have been the same. They stay the same, and they will stay the same for now as well. So for scope 3, we are expecting as a minimum a scope 2 alignment, which translates into this 1.23% annual reduction. So for scope 3, that's still acceptable. The other option is a 2-degree scenario. So we generally still accept 2 degrees. Also for the sectoral approach, if that's applicable. For instance, if you're a company that buys and processes cement. So you remember earlier I said that we have that cement pathway for the sector. So if that is what makes up the indirect emissions, the purchased product, then it's also fine to expect the suppliers that you buy from to decarbonize at that rate that we expect these homogeneous sectors, these heavy emitters, to decarbonize in. Of course, the buying company or the customer has a stake in that too, right? You can choose, for instance, the cement company that already produces lower carbon cement, etc. But it's also fair to generally assume that decarbonization rate. Then there's another option for intensity targets, which are economic-based targets, with a 7% year-on-year reduction. And the third one is, for some companies, the one that provides the largest flexibility, is to commit to zero growth, so to actually no specific absolute reduction, but no growth, but at the same time to a 2% physical intensity reduction. So this is specifically interesting for fast-growing companies that say, okay, we're doing a lot so in order to achieve this 2%, but yeah, it's too challenging to actually already at this stage decrease Scope 3 emissions in absolute terms. And these are just like some examples, and I think it was one of the questions as well on the Slido display earlier. But that's just the Scope 3 portions now. And I think one takeaway message really is that we leave a lot of flexibility on Scope 3 target development, also on Scope 3 wording, to really reflect what the company is really doing, what they're proud of, what they are working towards. So these are examples for the absolute option, the first one that I showed, which is pretty straightforward. So absolute reductions with a minimum of 1.23% per year. And these are the economic-based targets, and they can look differently between different companies, because you can also choose your indicator yourself. So here Caring, for instance, shows per unit of value added, and a Microsoft unit of revenue, but we also had per $1 million of sales, different indicators, same ambition. And then this was the third group, and I think that's a really interesting one. It's not necessarily the most transparent one, because it's not that easy to see what the company is really doing behind it. But you can always trust, if you've seen a proof target, that the numbers that we needed to calculate the actual ambition was compliant with our criteria. So that's, I think, a good thing. So here you can again, so as a reminder, it was a zero absolute growth, at the same time 2% physical intensity reduction, and you can again choose the indicator yourself. So for instance, per ton of food and packaging in the case of McDonald's, or for DSM, per ton of product produced. So that also works with a diverse product portfolio, and can be quite flexible.
We've got a question come through on Slido. So GHG protocol has many Scope 3 emissions to choose from. How do you make sure that the companies choose the ones that are material and don't cherry pick? Yeah, so the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has 15 categories in the Scope 3 portion, and we ask you to look at each category to at least be able to assess whether it's relevant or not. If it's relevant, well, you need to look at it, you need to calculate it, at least based on estimates. And then in the end, the boundary criteria for Scope 3 was 2/3. So companies need to choose enough emissions in whichever categories of this 15 that they want to overall cover 67% of their Scope 3 emissions. And then which ones to exclude, so which ones to not take into this 2/3, is also up to the company. It does not have to be part of the target, does theoretically also not have to be part of the reduction activities, even though higher boundaries, of course, very welcome. I hope that answered the question. So supplier engagement targets. I
will not go into much detail. The general concept is that you ask your suppliers to set science-based targets themselves. Most important here is they don't have to go through the institutional process of our initiative. We are not responsible for asking them, so companies are responsible for asking them to set these targets, to track progress, whether they actually set the targets, and they have to use science-based methods, but they don't have to commit, get approved, etc. And they also don't need a Scope 3 target, but you can only account for that portion of emissions into your own Scope 3 boundary that are actually covered by your suppliers' targets.
Another question, just before you move on.
Can you elaborate on that?
You had McDonald's up as an example there, I think. If you could we go back to that, and could you elaborate on that and how they expect suppliers to support or achieve reductions?
So that is not visible from the target because they don't have a supply engagement target, right? Theoretically, they commit to reduce across the supply chain, and then it is up to them to achieve this target. It is very, very likely that they need to directly engage with their suppliers, but there might also be other reduction levers that they're using first because they say, oh, it's too much work first. No, let's start with the low-hanging fruits and then go into elaborated supplier engagement. In the case of McDonald's, they are part of the CDP supply chain program, so they are requesting their suppliers to respond to CDP. So they're collecting primary sector-specific data, but I am not sure of their specific KPIs in that program, but I will shortly, show you the nexus between that supply engagement program and SPTs in a minute. So this is an example for a supplier engagement target. So here you can also not really, we don't know from reading the target, or if you go on the website, you don't know exactly how they work with the suppliers, for instance. But you then see that the claim is that, for instance, and I think the formulation here is quite interesting of HPE, that they said they will spend 80% of their procurement money on suppliers that have SPTs by 2025. So they really also formulate that as financial incentive. And yeah, this is just, I think, do we have a few more minutes?
Yes.
5? Yeah, just, these are some slides that just should show that it's a journey. I think that most companies, or many companies, are still in the beginning, but there's a lot of traction, and we really recognize that this is a journey, and that companies usually start with quite low data quality and with generic life cycle analysis data. And we have a lot of companies that set Scope 3 targets, get them approved, and are effectively working towards them based on generic life cycle analysis data. And then through that footprinting exercise and target setting exercise and collaboration across teams within the company, and just as we also heard, usually a process over some years. Also, the data quality improves significantly, and you can then also, for instance, submit a new inventory to the initiative if you, a few years later, see, okay, now we have primary data. And we base all our criteria on the greenhouse gas protocol, so generally recommend every company to use them for their footprinting journey. And we have, or the World Resource Institute Greenhouse Gas Protocol have developed this Quantis Scope 3 screening tool, which we recommend to use as freely available for a first Scope 3 evaluation of your footprint to identify hotspots and then see where it's worth to look into more detail. We also have a guidance document, which is called Best Practices in Scope 3 Greenhouse Gas Management. It's not so much about target setting, but then generally also for companies that are rather in the beginning on that journey, like what are the different levers? What can you do generally with your Scope 3 portion? And one example is supplier engagement, but there's many others. And there's also a case study on HPE, which actually quite in detail lays out how they are not only requesting their suppliers to deliver, but really work closely with them to support them as well, and to not overwhelm them with this ask to suddenly set science-based targets, but they're really working with them to educate them along and take them along that journey, even with like in-person workshops on target setting and inventory building. And last bit here, I already mentioned the CDP supply chain program. So we have quite many members that have SBTs, because the supply chain program is a quite effective tool to actually achieve your SBTs, specifically the Scope 3 portion and the portion to cover that portion of emissions that comes from the purchased goods and services. So how it works is that, I don't actually think I have an overview. Yeah, well, you request key suppliers through CDP to respond their emissions data, strategies, target setting, emission reduction initiatives. I don't know if you're familiar with the CDP questionnaire, but all the normal CDP climate change questions, you ask your suppliers to answer them to you. And then you can analyze this data, use the primary data for your footprinting, of course, but then also take them on this journey with you over the years to, first, they need to understand their environmental footprint, which helps you to understand your environmental footprint. Is that the right set? And the next step is then to, again, not overwhelm them and scare them away, to help them improve the performance. So set varying KPIs year after year. Okay, this year we're going to focus on renewable electricity, and we're actually going to help you. And we might, like we have supply chain members that bought bulks of renewables, and to actually be able to provide cheaper prices to their suppliers to then green their own Scope 3. So it's not absolutely altruistic, but it's still nice. And and then of course, if you're doing a thing like asking your suppliers to set targets, through this reporting exercise as well, to track the progress, how many of them have set targets, which ones, are they absolute, are they intensity, how much have they reached, etc. So it's a journey again, and there's tools available, and we are here to help. Others are here to help, and I think we can close with the words that collaboration is key. Thank you.
Just one question left there, Leah. Does the company get to choose the denominator for the intensity metric themselves? For example, CO2 revenue or employee or ton of product?
Yes. For the intensity measure, so yes, you do. So for the economic-based one, for the revenue one, you can choose, for instance, revenue, but then you have to use the economic-based approach with the 7% year-on-year reduction, while the physical intensity metric, if you want to choose per employee, or per FTE, or per ton of product, you have to go for this option 3, which was the 2% annual reduction. But yeah, within these different options, you can choose them quite openly. All right.